Good evening, folks, and welcome to everybody coming over from America First with Nick J. Fuentes. This is, of course, James Allsup here on America First Overdrive, and we have a very special guest with us tonight. It's not every day we get to do a debate here, but this week is going to be full of debates for the people here over at America First Media. Me today, obviously, with Destiny, and then Nick tomorrow with Will Chamberlain debating about Israel. But tonight, we're going to be talking about birth control, a very controversial, I should say, topic, a very touchy topic for a lot of people. And we're going to be talking about birth control and whether or not the government should be subsidizing it. So, of course, I'm joined here by Steve. Destiny, how's it going, man?
Hey, pretty good. You can call me Steve.
Okay, cool. Hey, so basically we got into it a little bit on Twitter and, as people tend to do on Twitter, and we had a disagreement about whether or not the government, this is essentially, for those of you who don't know, the backstory on this is the government, under the Trump administration, they decided to roll back an Obama-era directive that required insurance companies to cover birth control. So insurance companies and employers could agree not to cover it if they didn't want to, if it was a conscientious objection or something. And the Trump administration rolled back the directive that forced them to cover it. So people have been debating about this a lot over the past couple of days and week on Twitter. What is essentially, Steve, what's your case for why the government should be involved in this at all, and why should they be forcing companies to subsidize birth control?
So I guess it just seems like one of the really rare scenarios where if we invest in something, almost every single party wins. Money is ultimately saved by the state. We reduce the number of abortions. We have lower numbers of teenagers getting pregnant. The health impact to women that are prescribed birth control is oftentimes very positive. And it seems like the alternatives just haven't been effective in any of these areas. Like, for instance, like abstinence-only education.
So I guess then my question would be, why can't a insurance company or employer, if they're then providing the birth control, if they're the ones providing the insurance, why shouldn't they be able to opt out? It seems like, to me, for people who have religious objections, it seems like a rational opportunity for them, or it should be something available to them to opt out of covering that if they object to it.
I don't buy the religious objection thing. I mean, in society, our tax money goes towards supporting things that you might or may not have moral objections to. For instance, vegans are forced to pay taxes to subsidize like agriculture and whatnot. Farm animals and shit. People that ride bikes, have to pay taxes that maybe go towards, cars or the automobile industry in a roundabout way. Like, I mean, we pay people that are against wars, people that might even dodge drafts or whatever, their money is ultimately goes into the government for like the war fund and whatnot. So the idea that because I have a personal religious belief, I disagree with this thing that has a measurable positive impact in almost every single way. I don't think that's a legitimate argument against the issue. I feel like that opens a whole can of worms where you could be morally opposed to like a ton, like, should we be able to opt out of, funding the military? Is that like a thing that you...
Well, we already do allow objections on certain grounds. We allow exceptions for there are a litany of religious exceptions in our law that have been supported by the Supreme Court and actually enshrined by the Supreme Court. For example, there was a case, I forget the year. There were several cases actually where people were using drugs for religious purposes, and they're using peyote was the drug in question, and they are allowed to do so as part of a religious ceremony. There's religious exemptions to certain laws, and in fact, we do allow conscientious objection to military service. So we already do have this system in place where people who object to things on religious lines can opt out.
Yeah, but you can't opt out of where your taxes go to, right? These are kind of different things. Like, I think religious institutions can opt out of like certain types of taxes that they have to pay if they're recognized as religious. But this is different than like, I don't want my tax money going towards this thing, right? These are fundamentally different things. I don't think you can like delegate like I want 40% of my tax money to go to this. I don't want any percent to go to the military. Like, we don't really do that.
Right. No, I agree. But what's the question here is whether or not the insurance company should be able to opt out and not pay for the birth control, or whether employers should be able to opt out of paying for birth control. And it seems like if the employer is the one paying for it, then they should have the right and the ability to tell their employees, hey, we're going to pay for this, and this service, but we don't want to pay for birth control because we object to it. It's really not even a question of... It's not even birth control specific. If they want to say, hey, we don't want to pay for cosmetic surgery, I think they should have that same right. So why is it the government's job to intervene in that relationship between the employer and the insurance company and the end user of the insurance?
So I might have agreed with this before the ACA, but where we're being mandated now to purchase insurance on behalf of ourselves, right? The government is essentially forcing us to do it. I think that the insurance companies kind of have to fall in line in terms of what they offer for services. Also, insurance is... Oftentimes, your access to insurance can be pretty restricted based on your job, so I'm not sure if that's like a positive thing, right? For instance, if you work for a company, oftentimes you only have access to their insurance, so they can tell you what they will or will not cover. That can get like a little strange. I think that in a vacuum, I'm a pretty free market guy. I like minimal government intervention. So in a vacuum, I can kind of see the idea that, well, an insurance company shouldn't be forced to provide any service that they don't necessarily want to, but I'm forced to buy insurance. I have to do it now under government mandate. So if I'm going to be forced to purchase insurance and everyone else is going to be forced to purchase insurance from you, well, now there's going to have to be some minimum things that you provide as an insurance company. If you want all the benefit of the entire U.S. public being compelled to buy from you, well, now you have a minimum standard of service that you have to meet. You've almost become like a public service at that point, sort of.
And that makes sense for public entities that the federal government, when they're providing insurance plans, if they are providing plans on the exchanges or whatever, then they would be obligated to do that. But individuals who go out and choose to purchase a service, or if even better example, sticking with the employer model here, an employer, you don't have a right to insurance from your employer. You don't have a right to be insured by them. So if they want to say, hey, look, we will employ you and give you insurance as a condition of your employment, there's nothing then that they're not forbidding you from buying other insurance, right? They're not saying you can't buy this other policy. You can still buy that policy if you want, or you can just buy the birth control over the counter for $30 a month if you really want to. But there's no restrictive capacity that the employer has over you deciding where to get insurance from. They may offer a thing you don't like, but nobody's forcing you to take it.
I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, because if you have to buy insurance, right, you're forced to in the United States, or you pay a penalty that comes out to be, I think it's averaged out to what the average silver plan or whatever on your exchange would be, right? And also, all the insurance providers on the exchange, those aren't all federal programs, right? A lot of those are private insurers that are on the exchange, on the public exchanges. If you have to buy insurance, right, and your employee offers like some type of insurance, I mean, like, you have to buy something. I'm really uncomfortable with this idea that the companies are able to tell us that we're forced to purchase insurance from them, but they can then like neg out on some things that are so positive. Like, and I don't know, that just seems really weird to me that that you could make that argument. I guess, like I said, I would agree with you if we weren't forced to buy insurance, but since we're forced to buy some type of insurance, I don't feel like they should get to pick and choose what they offer.
But you can just buy the insurance that offers a better thing. And the free market will then dictate that whoever's offering the worst services, whoever's not offering birth control, for example, if that is a product in demand, the free market will then weed them out of competition, and they will not receive anybody signing up for them.
But that's not really how the free market works here. Right? There's huge market failures insofar as insurance goes. This has been demonstrated time and time again. If you look at the history of the United States, one of the biggest market failures attached to insurance is the fact that it's like inelastically tied into your job, into your employment. This has been one of the biggest failures of insurance in like American history, is the fact that you're tied to your employer to get insurance. Like, this is something that I think should be dissuaded as much as possible. So the idea that somebody has a job somewhere and can throw in, and oftentimes you get cheaper insurance with your job because you're pooled together, right? If that insurance is going to be restricted, and now you're forced to go buy other insurance that you can't really afford, I don't agree that there's going to be any type of market pressure there to move people into doing the right thing, because oftentimes people are always buying insurance with their workplace. Like before the ACA, for instance, how many people bought private insurance? It didn't really happen unless you were incredibly wealthy or self-employed, right? You pretty much always bought your work insurance because it was so much cheaper, because the market just fails insofar as providing medical insurance.
Yeah, I suppose that's still true, and I would agree with you that the ACA is. If you're arguing that the ACA is a problem, then I would agree with that. I think the solution to a lot of this stuff, and where we could have a better argument that is more principled, would be with the repeal of the ACA, because then if you eliminate that hurdle, then you can have a totally different discussion.
Sure, and
more than free market.
And again, for market principles, I kind of agree with you, but I think that even morally and ethically, I don't know if it would even be these insurers that should be doing things like this, like restricting access to birth control. We can move on to those types of arguments if you want as well. For me personally, I'm pro-life, and I'm very budget conscientious. I think that budgets should be balanced when possible. So anytime the state can save money and we can reduce the number of abortions, or we can reduce the number of broken families, children born out of wedlock, I think that all of those things should be advocated for, and restricting birth control to people seems to play against every single one of those points, like demonstrably show. Like, you can show that like through study after study after study. So it just seems like a weird stance to take.
Well, so that's a good topic to get into, is because I think that we can also separate out the financial benefits of birth control, which there may be. I'm not going to contest the idea that overall subsidizing birth control may save the state money. I think that's probably true. But what could save the state even more money would be things like forced sterilizations or mass abortion. So if we want to say that saving money is the only objective here, then I think we get into kind of a tricky territory.
No, I don't think so. Philosophically, we don't agree that these are the same thing, though. Philosophically, so I think I'm more in the libertarian camp in terms of philosophy goes. We want as little aggression against the individual as possible, right?
Right.
So when you talk about forced sterilization, this is a highly philosophically aggressive act. Could you save money on behalf of the state by doing it? Yeah, you could save money on behalf of the state by doing a lot of things that are very philosophically aggressive towards an individual. Giving somebody the access to take contraception, nobody's being compelled to take it or forced to take it. These two things are very dissimilar, I think.
Right. Well, and that's, again, what I was getting to is that there's a difference between what is the most fiscally conservative, you could say, that will save you the most money, and what is ethically and morally correct. Although there is a level of force required when you're saying that insurance companies and employers have to be forced to pay for these services that they may not want to, because that implies there's some kind of punishment for them if they don't. So you're just transferring where the force is, really. It's not an elimination of force to say that we're requiring insurers to pay for these things, or requiring employers to pay for these things.
Sure, but again, I think I can make a stronger argument for force on the side of the insurance companies, because you're forcing me to buy it, right? So like if I go march on a public street and I say I should be allowed to have freedom of speech here, right? I'm forcing you to put up with it, because all of our money goes towards funding public areas, and this is why we have the right to demand that, you know, free speech and all of this can be advocated for here, because we all pay for it. So again, with the insurance companies, like the government is telling me right now that every single person in the United States has to buy insurance. If that's the case, then fine, but all of you guys now are going to have to offer what we all agree on as a society is a baseline of services if we're going to be forced to buy from you. If it was all private companies or whatever, then you can all do whatever you want. But that's just not the case anymore, where we're being mandated. I have to pay a penalty at the end of the year for not having insurance. Like now,
right.
You know, right?
Yeah, I mean, as will I too. So, but I think that the ACA wrinkle is kind of a red herring in this conversation, right? Because we're not talking about what should be done. We're talking in a very constrained manner about the limitations that are being placed. That, you know, it sounds like that we don't even both agree with with what the ACA does. So, you know, I have an issue with that, of course, the ACA. But anyways, let's talk more about the birth control itself. Let's talk more about birth control as a product. Now, you mentioned on Twitter, and a lot of people have also mentioned on Twitter, that birth control is something that is used by people not only to act as a contraceptive, but also as a manner of eliminating, you know, irregular periods, you know, controlling flow, etc., of acting as another hormonal agent. Now, while that is true, I think that there are other alternatives that can be used there that don't necessarily require they don't require employers or insurance companies to pay for and to subsidize birth control, which they still may find morally objectionable. So I don't see birth control as the only option in these cases, because in fact there are many options that work even better than the birth control.
But that's not true. And why does your opinion there matter? Like birth control is that's not the medical community's opinion, right? For PCOS, for the polycystic ovarian syndrome, birth control is the lead prescribed thing. For things like issues with irregular periods, acne, menstrual cramps, things like that, birth control is the leading prescribed thing. Like in the medical community, that is the most often prescribed thing to deal with these issues. So I mean, you might think that there are other ways to deal with it, and that's fine, but that's not what the medical community thinks. Why would anybody adhere to the opinions of some people with a moral objection on medical grounds? That seems like a strange...
Well, no, there are side effects, though. There are alternatives to treat those things. The PCOS, I agree with you, the birth control is the best way to treat it. But the other hormonal irregularities, for example, there are other ways to treat that don't have the same side effects as birth control. Birth control is associated with things like weight gain. It's associated with depression. There are a lot of links that are not often publicized that birth control can actually have very detrimental health effects.
Well, everything is publicized. Birth control is very heavily studied in the U.S. The idea that there are secret side effects that aren't publicized is not true.
Right, no, but it's not talked about. It's not put out there.
I'm sure it's talked about. Of course, if you're a woman and you go and you talk to your OBGYN, they're going to give you... This is why there are different types of birth controls available. Not everybody is on oral contraceptives. Some people get an IUD. Some people go low hormone. Some people... This is why I kind of railed you when you tweeted out that $9 generic crap, and you said, look, birth control is only $9. Birth control is very, very unique to every single woman. This is why you have a conversation with your caretaker and you decide which birth control is best for you. Oftentimes, women will switch between oral contraceptives. One may not work as well as another. A generic brand might not have the same inactives that affect you in a different way that the name brand will, right? There are tons of different types of birth control. Are there side effects to some? Of course, but these aren't secret. And even though the side effects exist, doctors still are recommending the birth controls for things like PCOS and other types of period problems because it's very easily accessible. It has a very low impact. There are some side effects, but it's nowhere near as severe as more invasive operations or whatever.
Yeah, and that's all true. But again, that's not answering the question of why the employer should be forced to pay for it, which I guess we did already kind of address. So yeah, no, that's all true. And there are, of course, medical benefits to taking these things, but I think we also have to acknowledge that there are a lot of risks as well. There are the associated weight gain. There are studies from University of Texas that say that birth control leads to significant weight gain and changes in body mass. Again, these studies about depression, for example.
I'm familiar with it. I think it's a 2007 Texas study report. I'm familiar with the one you're talking about. One of the problems is that some types of birth control, first of all, I think that only applied to the injection, DMPA or something, that only applied to one specific type of birth control, firstly. Secondly, it didn't impact every single woman. It was just a percentage of them. And then thirdly, this just highlights the importance of women having conversations with their practitioners about what birth control is the most effective option for them.
Yeah, and healthcare should not be standardized, in my opinion. I don't think everyone should be receiving the same treatments.
Well, no, but you're on the argument right now where you're saying that one whole branch of like healthcare should be axed off because some people have a moral objection to it, even though we're all morally compelled, or we're all by law compelled to pay for it.
No, I'm not saying it should be axed off, but I'm saying that it should not be, no one should be forced to pay for it. I think forcing people to subsidize this thing that there may be moral objections to is where I run into problems with it.
Sure, but when you force people, when you say we're not going to subsidize this particular type of medical treatment, you're making it unavailable to the people that need it most and to the people that hurt our state the most, right? The people that need the birth control the most are the ones that end up having children out of wedlock that we have to ultimately pay for, right? Via welfare and other forms of subsidies.
We don't have to ultimately pay for it. We could.
Well, in today's society, there's no way. We're way past the point of rolling back those laws, right? And ultimately, we don't want these things anyway. We don't want single-parent households, right? There was a really interesting study in Chile where a bunch of, I think this happened about 15 years ago, where a bunch of companies colluded together, and there was a huge spike in birth control in like one day. Like this happened like immediately. And the really interesting thing is that the people could study it as kind of like an experiment, and they followed like 20 years after to see what happened to all the children. And in that 1 week, pregnancies increased by 4%. And the amount of pregnancies that increased were among all of the worst people in society to be getting pregnant. The people that had very high credit card debt, the people that were single, that went on to have broken families. And you could follow these children. They had worse results in school compared to the control groups. They had worse households. Oftentimes they were single-parent households. A lot of them had special education that were overrepresented compared to the main group because the status of the mother during pregnancy can have an impact on the birth of the child. Like it just seems like a really bad thing to cut off birth control to the groups of people that need it the most. Like I know that you say you're not getting rid of it completely, but effectively you kind of are, right? When the poorest people can't afford it anymore.
Well, I would contest that that there is no group of people that really needs it. And I think that when you in fact, increase the supply of birth control, you make birth control more accessible, what you end up doing is you end up enabling more sexual degeneracy.
So that's not true either, though, unfortunately, is that when you look at the studies for the difference, so there's 4 different breakdowns of this. You've got 8-hour, there's a big study, you've got 8-hour comprehensive sex ed, you've got 12-hour comprehensive sex ed, you've got abstinence only, and then you've got safe sex only. That when you look at these groups, almost none of the abstinence only kids delay their first sexual interaction anymore. Almost none of them have a different number of partners. Like kids still have sex. And I mean, we know this. I hate to say anecdotally, but we know this anecdotally. Like kids that are 17, 18 are going to fuck. There's no way that any type of program, is going to keep them from having sex. It just doesn't happen with teenagers. This is why some of the leading spokespeople, like Sarah Palin, have daughters that have multiple children, like out of wedlock. Like the abstinence-only education is like a demonstrative, like it's demonstrated to fail over and over and over again.
I'm not advocating for abstinence-only education. What I'm saying is that when you enable people through government subsidy, in this case, by subsidizing birth control, when you enable them to engage in more sexual degeneracy, which is what happens in more sexual partners, and we're seeing this the studies to back this up, that between the 1980s and the pill first became really prevalently used in the late 70s and 80s up until now. From the 80s up until now, the amount of sex that these young kids are having is increasing. And I'm not trying to be a moral purist here and say, sex before marriage is. I'm not trying to make like a religious or moral argument about that, but it leads to increased risks. It leads to increased risks, and it leads to a inability to form long-term relationships, which is something we see backed up by several studies where they say that the amount of sexual partners that you have before marriage impacts negatively there's a correlation between divorce rates and the amount of partners people have before marriage.
So, yeah, of course, and that's something that should be looked into, I agree. Although there are a lot of, you have to be careful how you word a lot of that too, because there are a lot of religious women that will stay in marriages for a long time or never divorce because of shame to their family or because they think they can only have one partner. Or if you're Catholic, you have to go to the church and get an actual annulment of your marriage in order to be remarried in the church. So you could argue that people getting divorced is actually people exercising their freedom of choice, right? And again, as a libertarian, I understand philosophically we might be different here. I don't know what your foundation is, but I'm usually on the side where I advocate for individuals being able to make the choices that they feel are the best. So if providing something enables people to make more choices concerning their personal freedom, I have a really hard time arguing about that. If you're trying to make the argument that like we should limit contraception so that teens can't choose to have sex more, well, if a person wants to choose to engage in sexual behavior, that should be their freedom of choice. This is the United States. You should have the right to do that.
But we shouldn't be subsidizing the degeneracy, I think, is really what the point is. And we shouldn't be subsidizing people to make bad decisions.
But this is,
and the choices may be good for the individual, and the idea that the world revolves around the individual is something that I know, as someone who's formerly libertarian, focusing on the individual rights and individual abilities to do what you choose. I know that's a big thing among libertarians, but the thing that is not often considered among libertarians, and thing I think we should be considering as an American governmental body here, is what is good for society, what's good for the greater good in society. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that enabling more kids to be sexually experimental or enabling people to have 6 to 9, 10 plus is really where the increase starts among sex partners impacting marriage. I don't think enabling that choice is a good thing. I think that by enabling that choice, we are then, granting people the ability to personally, have the personal fun or satisfaction. And that's fine, but we're also leading to the breakdown of the societal structures that are the underpinning of our society.
So I can't speak to breaking down of fundamental structures because I haven't seen that demonstrated in any way. I can tell you that there are structures that break down as a result of children being born out of wedlock, and it's very easy to demonstrate from a pragmatic point of view. You started off that sentence with "we shouldn't be subsidizing this," but we are. So if you don't want to pay for birth control for a woman today, then tomorrow you have to pay for a bigger police force to lock up a kid that's born to a single parent household that's going to be more predisposed to crime. You might have to pay for because people born into single households it's one of the leading indicators of whether or not you'll be a criminal. You're going to have to pay for government assistance programs. Sure, racially, but black people also have a huge issue with single-parent households, which can be fixed with better access to contraceptions, right? So you
but
also
it hasn't, though. That's just simply not true because we've increased access to contraception greatly over the past 30 years, and the out-of-wedlock birth rate continues to go up.
No, that's absolutely not true. According to a 2014 National Vital Statistics report, teen pregnancies fall on 57% between 91 and 2013.
That's not the statistic. That's not the statistic I'm talking about. I'm talking about African-American out-of-wedlock birth, which is what you were talking about. And that statistic that rate has in fact gone up in the past 30 years.
Okay, you could argue that these are people that are economically disenfranchised the most and need the most access to these types of medications. I don't know what the specific African-American birth rate is, but I don't think their bodies are impervious to contraception any more than white people are. And I know that the global rates...
Increasing access hasn't fixed it.
Has access been adequately increased? What is the stat for that African-American? I'm just curious. Where did that come from?
I'll look it up, but it's real. I'll find it.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I don't mean to put you on the spot or anything, but I know that all of the national averages have fallen greatly since birth control has been made available. And that if you look at, I know there's a study in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 2006, the results suggest that legal access to the pill before age 21 significantly reduced the likelihood of first birth before age 22, increased the number of women in the paid labor force, and raised the number of annual hours worked. Access to the pill before the age of 21 reduced the likelihood of being a mother before the age of 22 by 14 to 18%, and it increased employment as well. So I guess I didn't look for specific impacts on the black community. I guess depending on where you live and what kind of access you have, it maybe these people still don't have access to these types of birth controls. But in every other area where birth control, California and Colorado both have massive, they have state-funded birth control or contraception programs that give contraception to people that need the most. So people are in poverty, lower wage class people. And some of the cost savings here are like insane. Like for every $1 spent on certain types of contraception, $7 is saved on behalf of the state, right? That would go on to be spent on like WIC or other types of welfare, EIC, whatever, that would go back towards families. So like, I don't know. It just seems like the money savings part and the overall impact, it seems to be pretty obvious.
But it's not addressing the problem, and those studies can work in a vacuum, and those decisions can work in a vacuum, sure. But again, the rates, what we're really trying to address here, if we're really trying to address the broken families and out of wedlock births and teen pregnancy, et cetera, we're not addressing it, and increases to access and contraception aren't addressing it, because now, as of I believe this is 2012, 73% of non-Hispanic blacks have birth rates out of wedlock. And so, again, this has coincided with the increase in access to birth control. Birth control prices now are lower than they ever have been. We saw people on Twitter saying, "Oh, my birth control costs $30 a month." Okay, well, $30 a month is not that much money. So, even if you're paying that out of pocket,
it's not that much to you. But not every birth control is $30 a month, and to some people, $30 a month can be prohibitive. I mean, it depends on what's going on.
Okay, well, every clinic has free condoms, and ultimately, not having sex costs nothing. So if you're really in a low income situation and you're concerned about not having a child, you can just choose to not have sex. And
sure, and if you're in a low income situation, you don't make much money, you can also choose to start your own business and become wildly successful. I mean, we can look at the decisions that people make in real life, and then we can look at those. I mean, this argument like you can just choose to not have sex just doesn't seem to have worked at any point in human history, at any point of the planet. So I don't know why that argument just doesn't seem to hold any merit to me. Like, just tell people not to have sex. If anything, people that are in lower income situations with less access to entertainment and social activities seem to be engaging in sex the most, because it's one of the only forms of recreation they have. So the idea that you can just say don't have sex just doesn't seem to make very much sense to me. You point to the fact that for a second.
So no, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, you point to the fact that black people are still fucked in terms of family situation, and that might be true. But the national birth rate has fallen as contraception has become more available. So that seems to point to some sort of issue more specific to those communities than just saying that contraception has failed. When every single study seems to herald the effects of contraception on out of wedlock pregnancy, on teen pregnancy, on women delaying their first child, on women participating in the labor force.
Well, then again, you're conflating two things. You're talking about the national overall birth rate and equating that to teen pregnancy. That's not entirely true. I mean, a lot of the reason that people have stopped having kids and the birth rates are so low is because the economic situation is that women have to work more now. Women have to be in the workforce more now. And so there's less time to rear children. Also, it's more expensive to have a kid if you're in the middle class. If you are poor in America, it's actually cheaper to have a child than it is if you're in the middle class, because you'll get more in subsidies for doing so. And I think that's the problem that a lot of people aren't talking about. And you, coming from a libertarian background, it seems like you could possibly agree with part of this, that part of the reason that we have such a problem with out of wedlock birth is that people know their kids will be taken care of. People know that the government will come in with money to take care of their children. And I think that we could go a long way towards reducing the out of wedlock birth problem if we simply cut off the subsidies and said, hey, we're not going to feed your kids if you have kids that you can't take care of. I think that would go a long way towards solving the problem. But birth control and things like that just seem to me to be window dressing over the real problem, which is personal irresponsibility.
Okay, so for the second part, I don't think we're ever just going to cut off funding to impoverish people and say you can starve if you fuck up. I don't think that's ever going to happen. You agree with that? Realistically, whether or not you like it, that's probably nothing that's ever going to happen, right?
I don't know. I mean, societies in the past have done it, and they've instituted policies that restrict the access to having children. In fact, the U.S. has done it with Buck v. Bell back in the 1920s, where we had policies that if you were the grandchild of a felon and your father was a felon, I think it was some sort of testing that they used, and they said, well, if you have 3 generations of people who are just not fitting in society, you get sterilized, and that worked to great effect. California was actually one of the leading frontiers for sterilization policies worldwide. So we've done it before in the U.S. and it has worked. The
fact that you have to go back 100 years to find an example of us doing this, I feel like this is probably something that's not going to happen anytime soon in the United States. So it doesn't really seem. I don't think we're ever cutting off welfare to every single poor person in the United States if they have children.
I mean, that's a current year argument. That's not addressing whether it's right or wrong. It's just addressing the possibility of it happening.
Sure. I guess when I try to root these arguments, I try to think of it pragmatically, like what the way forward. What is the successful way going forward? And the idea that we're going to somehow roll back every single welfare program that exists to mothers that have children. I mean, aside from the moral arguments against this, it just seems like that's not really worth considering that much, because I just don't see that happening anytime soon. I guess it could, since it did once for a specific situation in the 1920s related to felons, but it just doesn't seem like something that's worth discussing.
You're limiting yourself. Have some imagination here. We're trying to come up with the best solutions, not limit ourselves with boring pragmatism.
Well, yeah, but I guess I prefer the pragmatism to American fanfics. But one other thing you said is that
other countries have done it. I mean, other countries throughout the world have done this to great effect as well.
Possibly. I can't speak to other countries. I'm an American and I prefer the values of the United States. I'm sure there are other states that have different, values around the world, but I prefer this one. So I can't really speak to those. I know that in Chile, when that price collusion happened, I know that even poor people had a fuck ton of children. I mean, these are things that you have to deal with in one way or another. Even if you do cut off subsidies, you're probably just going to increase the crime rate at that point, or you're going to increase the burden on family members or other people or other social systems. Like somewhere is going to suffer, right? You're not just going to have hundreds of thousands of poor people dead in the streets. Like this isn't a realistic way forward, right? Something is going to be tested or strained here at some point that's going to demand the attention of the government in some way. And usually addressing the problems earlier is cheaper than waiting until you've got piles of dead children on the street because you've decided to cut off all welfare spending.
Yeah, but it seems like we're just continuing to find ways to put new wallpaper over the collapsing walls. Like we're not addressing what these root problems are. And
but we are
increasing access to
contraception.
Well, no,
does. We can demonstrate, right? Or at least economists at Harvard, people that run data for the National Vital Statistics, people that report data for the CDC, all seem to agree that oral contraception has provided a massive reduction in the number of teenage pregnancies, even controlling for things like the falling birth rate compared to other people that don't use contraception. It's not like every single teen is taking contraceptives and they would have decided not to have children anyway. Like these things are definitely linked and probably to a causal degree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and while you're doing that, you're also enabling, again, you're enabling people to engage in more and more rootless, meaningless sexual
These are all
activity,
value statements of your personal morals that I don't really care about. And I don't think anybody in the United States deserves to have your personal morals asserted onto them in terms of public funding.
But we can observe that these things have a negative impact on people in the long term.
Negative for you. You say that a divorce is negative. Maybe it's not really that negative. I don't know. Maybe that's a big religion.
You just said that broken families and children growing up in broken families was a negative thing. So in fact, I think we both agree on these.
A divorce doesn't always imply a family. You can get divorced from somebody without having a child.
Okay, right. Yeah, yes, you can. But the point here being that people who have children and then get divorced, that is then a broken family. And
have the number of broken families increased in the United States? I haven't seen that number anywhere. The number of single parent families, it seems to have decreased in most communities outside of the Black community, is facing a problem pretty unique to them. Although I think even they had one, they had it falling a little bit. But I mean, two people.
I don't believe that's true. In fact, I think it has increased. The number of single parents has increased in the U.S.
I hate to.
I'll find that statistic because I'm genuinely curious. You may be right, but I think it has increased.
Okay, because like if some people get divorced, that's a lot different than like. Would you agree that if two people were in their 20s or 30s and they got divorced and they had a child, that's a much different situation than somebody who's 14 getting pregnant and having a child, right? That one child is going to be. I'm broken up with my child's mom, but my child goes back and forth between our houses. Both of us are financially well off. He sees both parents. He goes to a good school, right? That my child is in a fundamentally different spot than somebody who's 16 and has a kid and has no money, no connection with the father, no support structure, right? That these are fundamentally different situations.
Yeah, they're different. Sure.
Yeah, so I don't think these are the same comparison. That's saying just because divorces increase because we have more sex, which is something that's happening anyway, regardless of whether or not you have contraception, means that we need to get rid of contraception. When you can't demonstrate anywhere in the United States that getting rid of contraception keeps people from having sex. If you look at like all the highest like teen pregnancy rates, you go to all the southern states, Texas, Georgia, like all of these states are like leading the boards in terms of child pregnancy. It seems like that approach doesn't work. And even if you personally believe that it is sexual degeneracy for these people to run around and be fucking each other, you can still advocate against that all you want while still making contraception available. There are plenty of women that are on contraception that don't have sex before marriage because they use it for health benefits or to regulate their periods or anything else.
Right. So since I just found the stat, since 1990 is the latest, the furthest this goes back. This is from PRB.org, which is a population reference bureau. 1990, the percent of children in single parent families was 25%, and in 1998 it was 29%. So it's a 4% increase over 8 years. And in the year 2000, this is kind of old data, but it was at 28%. So there has been a marginal increase in the amount of people in children living in single parent families, which then when you look at the rising divorce rate, or the divorce rates that were rising at the time, and the rates of out of wedlock birth, you can say that this is leading to more and more broken families. Now, you can of course make the correlation causation argument and say that, well, the increase in birth control, show me the stats that link that directly to the increase in divorce, etc. And that's a fair point to make, but I don't think anybody can deny that the increase in access to birth control enables these more risky behaviors, because it enables people to engage in the behaviors without consequence. So now, the abstinence-only education, again, we're talking about southern states. That is, you have to look at the demographics of those states as well, because there are disproportionately about 30% in a lot of southern states, 30 to 40% African American, which we see across the United States. They have more teen pregnancies regardless. So it would only make sense that when you increase the population and percentage of African Americans in a certain region, that region will have more out of wedlock birth. It'll have more teen pregnancy, because that's something that we see across the whole U.S. So I don't think it's possible to entirely dismiss the correlation here.
So the problem is I understand what you're saying, but the numbers just don't exist to back that up, right? That in every study, the Journal of Adolescent Health publishes a lot of studies about comparative analysis between people that receive different forms of sex education, and these studies that people that get abstinence-only education don't have as much sex as other kids. These studies just don't exist. All the data shows the opposite, that the amount of children that have engaged in sexual activity is about the same no matter what. Like whether they have super comprehensive sex ed, which includes abstinence only and contraceptions, whether they have safe sex only education, or whether they have abstinence only education or no sexual education. It seems like they engage in sexual activity about the same rates. There's not this huge variance. And this is an argument that I hear pushed forward kind of a lot by people that try to like moral crusade on this, that like, well, if we give them condoms, they're going to have sex more. But it seems like they do regardless of whether or not they have access to contraception or learned about it. The only difference is how many of them get pregnant, which ultimately is what I'm concerned about, because that's what I have to pay for at the end of the day, and that's what leads to real corruption in the United States at the end of the day. You might be mad that people have sex more, or that might bother you, the degeneracy, but things like crime rates, things like burden on the state, things like labor force participation, things like economic value, like these are things that I think these are things that concern everybody, regardless of your moral position, unless you're like some extreme nihilist hedonist or something, right? Every single person in the United States is concerned about the number of criminals on the street. Every single person in the U.S. is concerned about how much of their federal income tax is going towards entitlements and welfare. Every single person in the United States is concerned about, like the size of their police force and how much money has to go into, all these other programs. Like these are things that concern everybody. The idea that a handful of people want a moral crusade against children having sex for some reason, and then can't even demonstrate data that shows that keeping them from contraceptives even helps. I don't think that's a really strong argument in opposition to making oral contraception or any kind of contraception available to these people.
Well, again, you're conflating abstinence-only education, which is not what I'm pushing, with the actual consumption of the birth control. Those are two totally different things.
What's the alternative to availability of contraceptive versus not having sex?
Well, no, I mean, you're talking about one is an educational philosophy and one is a government policy where you're subsidizing access to these things. They're fundamentally different.
Well,
and
no, they're fundamentally.
I would completely concede your point on abstinence-only education, which is why I don't support abstinence-only education, and it has been demonstrated, not to work in many cases. So I don't have any objection to that point. But wait, talk about
just because this is a confusing stance to me, because subsidization happens for schools, right? Our properties subsidize school education, so sex education is by extension of that kind of subsidized. Why would you be in favor of teaching people in schools how to properly use contraception, but then be opposed to providing the contraception that you're already paying for them to learn how to use?
Because it's a risk management. I mean, by doing the by providing such a sex education, you are doing a sort of risk management there. You're teaching people how to use these things, but that is not the same as saying we need to pay for it. I mean, this is like, teaching anything and then not having to pay for it. It's not really a contradiction at all.
Well, but the risk management is higher on your end than it is on my end. On my end, I can demonstrate that for every dollar I spend on contraception, I'm saving multiple dollars at the end of the day. So it seems much less risky for me to pay for contraceptions or contraceptive availability to poor people than it is for you to risk not paying for it and then to, I think as you said, just tell them to stop having sex. That seems like a much riskier proposition that at the end of the day deals significant damage to society compared to just having a few more sexual deviants running around.
But the problem is we're not just having a few more sexual deviants running around. We are wholesale enabling people by providing their birth control, by subsidizing their birth control as a state. We are enabling them to engage in this behavior that has a long-term detrimental behavior. It has a long-term detrimental effect on society.
So you keep saying we're enabling a behavior. This behavior is enabled no matter what. It's going to happen regardless. This is like saying by putting seatbelts in cars, we're enabling people to get into more car accidents. Car accidents happen regardless of whether or not the safety belt is available, but we have it there to reduce the number of people killed during car accidents. This idea that making contraception more available causes more people to have sex is just not in the numbers anywhere. That's just not demonstrated anywhere.
Well, it is because, again, once oral birth control became more available in the late 70s and early 80s, that's when we started to see the rise in people having casual sexual encounters. And this has been demonstrated in multiple studies.
But it hasn't been. This is a correlation. Like the sexual revolution of women and feminism has caused a whole bunch of stuff sexually to change in the United States. People get, for instance, one of the leading ways you measure that is sex before marriage. People used to get married much, much, much earlier, 18, 19, sometimes right out of high school, people get married. That age has been put off dramatically so. So now somebody could have sex 40 years ago at 18, and that would be considered married sex. Now somebody can have sex at 24, 25, and they've never been married yet, right? So now our premarital sex rates are climbing.
Right, so, and that's a bad statistic to use. But what you can look at is the rise in people's social attitudes towards premarital sex, and that is, I had that up here somewhere, where people who, when they do the polling, they are more accepting of it nowadays.
Sure. So this kind of, we can bring this back then into a kind of a philosophical discussion, if you want, about whether or not people should have sex before marriage. But again, we're pushing, these are very, very personal moral views now that we're pushing after abdicating the platform that we have any grounds to stand on financially, right? Because you're essentially saying, okay, well, maybe the state will lose money. Maybe we'll have more out of wedlock birth. Maybe more teenagers will get pregnant. And maybe we'll have a bunch of health issues for women. But I have this philosophical belief, right? Like, well, I mean, fuck, like Muslims use that in countries to justify fucked up shit all the time. Like, that just seems like a really crazy, archaic stance to take. Like, that seems like a hyper conservative. Like, I have a belief personally that's bad for society on every measurable level, but I feel really strongly about this thing, so I think I should be able to compel everybody else to do it financially.
Right, but it's not measurable for society. It's not bad. It's not bad for society on every measurable level. It is. I'm completely conceding that there may be financial risks and it may be more expensive, absolutely. But we have to look at what the overall effect on society is. And when you look at the ability or the enabling of these things, these broken homes and these divorces and people, having kids and then breaking up, and there is less risk attached to sex now, that then, I think that presents so many more externalities than just the simple birth rates do. There than simple, teen pregnancies do.
Yeah,
I think there's so many more externalities that lead to much worse things happening in society with that. So I would rather lose the money, is what I'm saying.
Sure,
I'd rather lose the money.
But that might be true, but that has to be demonstrated. Then you're going to have to show some sort of long-term study that shows that even though, so like here would be an example study, even though the teenage birth rate was so much lower, the amount of economic harm caused by people not getting married or something, like, ended up overshadowing the money saved on not having teenage pregnancies or whatever, right? Like, the problem is that, like, I can demonstrate, like, in very clear ways, like, teenage pregnancy has fallen dramatically. Most people agree that, like, the CDC, Vital Statistics, Harvard publishers, like, people agree that that the birth control has contributed greatly to the pregnancy rates falling amongst teens. And then your counter to that is, well, but people having more sex is kind of bad in a lot of these kind of more externality ways. Like, well, this can be measured. You can measure these things, and there are people that do studies to measure these things, but you would have to have this measured so that you can actually present, like, a legitimate argument in the face of, 14 to 18% decrease in teenage pregnancy rates. This is something that I can demonstrate that everybody agrees is good, and all the externalities of that, everybody agrees is good. Lower crime, lower burden on the state, better economic opportunity for women, better health outcomes for women. Like, these are all things that are better that I can show very clearly.
I don't disagree with any of that. But again, what you're consistently avoiding here is the fact that this is from the Institute of Family Studies here, a study from 2002 to 2013, where they find that the increase in amount of sexual partners decreases the permanence of someone's marriage. And we look at the data.
Yes,
that,
but so, like, we can talk about that specifically. I don't care. Like, maybe marriage is something that doesn't work necessarily in society anymore. Maybe it does. Maybe we need to change our attitudes on that. But, like, if I can give up teenage pregnancy, if we're at a trading table, okay, if I'm Trump and I'm going to give up teenage pregnancy, higher crime rates, higher burden on the state, federally and state budgets, right, higher out of wedlock children birth, right, and I can trade that for more people getting divorced, I'll take that trade every day of the week. Like, that's an easy trade. Also, marriage is also highly linked to economic opportunity as well, and a faltering middle class has been contributing to lower marriage rates as well. Not necessarily just the birth control stuff, but that could be a plausible explanation for why marriage rates have fallen too.
Yeah, and we could improve the middle class's situation by spending less money on welfare for people who have too many kids and things like that. But it's not just marriage, right? You're trying to condense down all of the benefits to a strong marriage, right, and a strong institution of marriage in the national context, you're trying to condense that down just to marriage. But marriage goes beyond that. Marriage provides so many more benefits for society, like, for example, raising children in a two-parent household, which is, according to every single metric, better for the kid. It leads to smarter kids, higher IQ children. It leads to more future economic opportunity for the children. There have been a litany of studies that are demonstrating this, and nobody seriously contends that children who are raised in single-parent households are just as well off as kids who are raised in two-parent households. Everyone agrees to this. Every sociologist, every expert agrees to this. Okay, and so we can't just sum it down to, it's just marriage that is being taken away in exchange for this sexual deviance and these other benefits.
So that's
because
something
it affects our future generations more than we like to think about.
Sure, and that's something that would be addressed, or I imagine you would want to address, but that doesn't get rid of everything else for birth control. Like, even if there are some more people that are being,
and that's why it's a debate. That's why it's a value judgment.
Well, but it's not a value judgment, because your value judgment is that there might be some people that are more likely to be in single-parent households because more people get divorced, but I can point to absolute concrete numbers for teenage pregnancy that are much more detrimental than somebody in their 20s and 30s. Right? Not all single-parent households are the same, and single-parent households wouldn't be as great at a disadvantage against dual-parent households if all else was equal as well. Right? My child lives in a single-parent household, kind of. Right? His mom and I get along, but we trade the kid. But I'm very wealthy. He goes to a very wealthy school. He's got all of his clothes. Everything is fine for him. He's in a much different situation than somebody that's 16 and gets pregnant. So the idea that you can equivocate these two things, that, well, there are some people that live in broken households now because some people are getting divorced, like, I just don't think that holds very much water compared to lowering like the teenage birth rate.
You do understand that you are an extreme anecdote, and your situation is an extreme positive anecdote as compared to the rest of the single parent.
No, I don't even agree with that. I think mine is a negative anecdote. My child would be better off if he was in a dual parent household. If me and the mother were still together, he'd be better off. I'm just saying that when you say single parent household, the reason why a single parent household, you said earlier that all psychologists and sociologists agree that dual parent households is better than single parent. That's absolutely true. But that's also because a lot of single parent households are super fucked. And one thing that contributes to that super fuckness is teens getting pregnant. That if every single parent household was like mine, it probably wouldn't be that big of a deal. I'm sure it would still be worse than being in a dual parent household. But if every single parent household was a working mother, a working father that has a kid, and they work together and they got pregnant in their mid-20s instead of their mid-teens, single parent households probably wouldn't be as huge of a deal or as huge of a leading indicator of crime as they are right now compared to kids getting pregnant in school, like in high school and grade school, right?
Well, yeah, and the kids should not be getting pregnant in grade school at all. Definitely. No, what I meant by when I said your example is a positive is that as compared to other single parent households, compared to other single parent households,
also because I didn't get
median income and your availability, and your kids are much better off than most people who are having children in single parent households.
Sure. But you can agree then that kids that are born to single parent households when that parent is in their mid or late 20s are going to be a lot better off than teens getting pregnant, right?
Possibly. It depends on the dynamics. Yeah, no, it does. I mean, it depends on on average, yes, you're probably correct.
Okay,
yeah,
so even if we have a small bump in single parent households later in life, that's an easy trade off compared to a 10 to 15% decrease in teen pregnancies, right? If there's a small, what did you say, 4% increase or whatever in single parent households later on in life, I would gladly trade that for 15% of an increase in teen pregnancy. That's an easy trade.
Right, that's only a 4% increase over 8 years. We don't know how big that increase is. I'm trying to find that statistic,
sure,
because I think it's a better picture.
And I agree that that's a bad thing too. But I still think that's something that we could combat. We can combat that. We can talk about that socially. We can try to enact programs to do it. But getting rid of birth control just doesn't seem to be the way to do this, right? That when I because I was trying to find this because you go into the Scholar Google and you try to find like birth control impact, child rates or whatever, or pregnancy rates. You just can't find these numbers. Every study says the same thing, that teens, and again, anecdotally, most of us know this to be true, and I even went to a private school, I even went to a Catholic school, that teens fuck. When they hit 15, 16, 17, it's just what they do. It's what kids have always done throughout all of modern history. The only difference is that it used to be that they were fucking at 15, 16, 17, but they were married at 15, 16, 17, and now we don't get married. We're getting married later and later and later in life, right? That people, the marriage rates for the United States have been pushed back farther than they ever have in human history. So, of course, you're going to have more premarital sex because the age at which we start fucking is about the same as it always has been.
Sure. Yeah. And as marriage gets pushed off later, of course, the amount of premarital sex will increase. The issue is, though, we're not just subsidizing kids who are teenagers to be taking birth control. We're subsidizing birth control for people into their 20s and 30s, and they then end up living on birth control, right? And they end up never having children. They end up never oftentimes never getting married and living that single lifestyle for forever. And I don't think that's something we should be subsidizing. I don't think that's something we should be enabling. If we were to talk about a program where kids, you have access to birth control between the ages maybe of 15 and 22 or something, that is a lot more appealing to me than just providing this for women ad infinitum, providing it forever. Because I think the government policies and policies we have as a government should serve the best interest of the people, and enabling people to never have children is, I don't think, a positive thing for society.
I guess, but again, we would have to go back to room on philosophy. Like, I would always argue that enabling a person to make individual choices to the best of their ability about their childbearing status is always going to be superior to the government through economic or fiscal policies getting people to have children. So, like, if the argument was ever that, like, well, if we stop providing birth control to people in their 30s, more of them will accidentally get pregnant. Well, that's not something that I would ever be philosophically in favor of saying.
Right, but I guess that comes down to individualism versus a more collectivist ideology.
Sure,
and,
but then we also have to be careful because you keep
careful about using the term force, because you're saying we don't want to economically force or institute any other type of force to force people to have children. Right? Fine, I would agree with that. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we need to be enabling people to live lifestyles and to engage in sexual promiscuity and engage in lifestyles where they don't have children. The government should be, in my opinion, a neutral party on this, and it should not be subsidizing one way or the other.
But a neutral party means offering the choice to the person, right? Right now, the government is a neutral party. For it to be not neutral, they would have to force you. They would have to compel you to take birth control. And I would be just as philosophically opposed to that. If a woman doesn't want to take birth control, she doesn't have to. We're not subsidizing the forced birth control of women. It's their option to do it. And, if you were to say maybe we shouldn't make it available to women past their 30s or whatever, even that I would probably take issue with, but I'd be more on board with that than for teenagers. But even at that point, even with the spending that we do for women past their 30s, it still comes out as being cost effective. So, this idea that we're burdening the state by paying for them, that burden that you're talking about, that's only a moral burden on some people. That's not a financial burden, because that really can't be demonstrated in any way.
Well, it's not free. We're paying for it at some point.
But them getting pregnant isn't free either. Because, again, the people that need the most help, right? This was shown in the Chile study, that the people that ended up getting pregnant when those companies colluded, the people that ended up getting pregnant, most of them were overrepresented in things like credit card debt, right? And most of those children, right? Prenatal environments are really important for kids, for the mother to be healthy, stress-free, to do what she can to make her pregnancy as healthy as possible. That these are the people that you are providing free contraceptives to are oftentimes the people that need it the most. And when I say need it the most, I don't mean in like a touchy-feely way. I mean it in like these are people that will be the largest fiscal burden on the state kind of way. These are the people that are going to leech the most healthcare off the system, that are going to have the highest chances of a kid being fucked and growing up, and him in turn leeching off the system, right? That these effects will ripple throughout society. Whereas giving them access to contraception, again, to go back to the car analogy, we put a seatbelt in every single car, even though not every single person is going to be in a car that, has an accident that requires the use of your seatbelt.
Yeah, but putting the seatbelt in every car enables people to feel like there's a safety net there to protect them if they do get in an accident. And the safety belt analogy is not a perfect analogy, of course, but when you're providing people more and more opportunities to engage in risky behavior, you are then enabling and subsidizing them doing so. And I think that really is the difference that we have.
It is the difference, but you keep saying that, but those numbers don't exist. If you find any after, you can tweet at me or whatever, but there is no study that says that as soon as contraception was made available, way more people started having sex. Those numbers just don't exist. They don't exist anywhere. So the idea that we're enabling risky behavior that's just not true.
Right. I know you keep coming back to this link that there's no link perfectly demonstrating what this factor of what you're saying and this other factor of what you're saying, and I'll agree that I haven't found that it may be out there and I haven't found that, but we can look at what these things are doing to society as a whole and to society more broadly, and we can say, and I don't think anybody can seriously deny that when you increase the access to birth control, you're then increasing people's ability to have no strings attached sex, which we have seen increase since birth control has become more and more accessible. accessible. And so I think to try to suggest that those two things aren't linked is kind of silly.
Yeah, and I can maybe agree with that NSA sex is probably a lot easier with birth control. But now these are things that even if you feel strongly against them, and I understand that some people do. Again, I was born into a Catholic household. Even if you feel strongly against that, man, those arguments are way tougher than the fiscal or economic arguments against birth control, right? If somebody comes at you and says like, well, we can save money on the state, we can have less teen birth, we can have all these positives that I mentioned, but there is this one drawback where now people are having more sex. Well, whether or not more sex is good or bad, that's up for debate. There's very different philosophical points of view on that in terms of how people feel. Now, there are some people that will argue that that's bad. There are a lot of people probably today that would argue that that's good, but you won't find hardly anybody arguing that more single households for teens is good, that more teen pregnancy is good, that worse women's health is good, that worse economic viability of women is good, right? You won't find people arguing these things. So you can't really present these as like, these are the equivalent arguments on both ends. Like, now I know that you're saying this, however, more people will be having no strings attached sex. Like, well, okay. I mean, this is up for debate for whether this is even bad, and I can demonstrate that all of these things over here are very bad, you know?
Yeah, no, and I think that, that's certainly true, and I think that we're definitely coming at this from different angles, because again, like, the primary argument that you've been making is a fiscal one, it's a financial one, and that's something that I'm not disputing those numbers at all, but I think that I'm trying to argue this from more of a moral perspective, and obviously you're coming from more of the fiscal perspective.
Even slightly morally, I'm believe it or not, I'm like the only fucking atheist libertarian I know. I'm actually very pro-life. I think abortion is a form of murder. I'm not even joking. I'm not being ironic when I say that. So my policies too are also geared at, I want to reduce the number of abortions as much as possible. And teens are the most likely people to seek abortions as well. And you can demonstrate that less teens getting pregnant and more teens having access to contraception leads to less abortions as well. So even from that like moral point of view that I feel strongly about, I think that I think that having contraception available is an overwhelming positive. For the sex thing, again, like if I were to agree with you and I were to say that, like sex is bad and not teens or whatever shouldn't be engaging in sex, that's fine. And you can make that argument, but attacking the birth control just doesn't seem to get you anywhere in terms of making any grounds there. Like you could concede that ground completely and say, okay, well, contraception is available for everybody. That's fine. And then still go on your personal moral crusade against, sex before marriage. Like, okay, well, you have contraception for these reasons, but you still shouldn't you shouldn't have a ton of sex because you open yourself to, for instance, STDs, right? Whether or not you have access to contraception or not, the STD rates are pretty similar. You're still just as likely to get an infection if you're on any type of birth control or whatever. So you can make a lot of arguments against sexual degeneracy and all of that while still having the contraception be freely available, just because there are so many other benefits shown there. And again, restricting access to contraceptions for poor people doesn't help your point in getting less people to have sex because they do it anyway. The difference is just that when they used to do it, they were already married because people got married at absurdly early ages.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of truth to that. Hey, before we go here, we're closing into the hour mark. I wanted to bring up something that's directly related to this topic. It is something that, in my history learning about political science and U.S. history, reproductive rights history in America, it's the idea of the voluntary sterilization. Now we talk about, I think we can both agree that forced sterilization is probably a moral wrong. We can both argue that from a libertarian perspective as being a wrong thing and from a individual rights perspective. But what about the topic of voluntary sterilization? Now this is something that's been experimented with in Europe a little bit, where they will subsidize you to get sterilized if you don't want to have kids. What do you think about that? Because it's something that is kind of a new idea that's resurfacing now with a lot of this birth control debate coming back. And like I mentioned at the start, this is an area where people could save a lot of money. Especially people who are impoverished. If they were to get a check for $1,000 to not have a kid, there could be a great financial benefit to the state there. What do you think about that?
Okay, so personally for me, I used to be a hardcore libertarian. Now I'm pretty left-leaning. The reason for that was because philosophically I'm very much a libertarian, but pragmatism always comes first for me. So I'm always interested in what are the actual effects on society, and then I hope that my philosophy will inform how I feel about that, if that makes sense. So when you talk about something like the idea that you could volunteer for sterilization, so philosophically, volunteering for sterilization sounds good. Because the state isn't forcing you to do it, and I'm usually okay with people making their own decisions. Pragmatically, I would have to see how that plays out, because if you're offering money to do it, you might be incentivizing certain groups of people to be doing this, or certain classes of people to be doing it. And I don't know, like, how you get into like a borderline eugenics argument there, which even eugenics, I understand there can be arguments for it on both sides. I would definitely say yes if this was sterilization that can be reversed. For instance, like vasectomies, I think can be reversed pretty easily. I don't know about for women if their forms of sterilization are reversible or not. But yeah, I don't know. That's a pretty tough one. I'd have to think about that a lot. That's kind of like a similar-ish argument as like, is it okay for the military to offer a lot of money for people to join? Because then the idea is that you would only get the poor people fighting your wars, because poor people would be incentivized to sign up because of the fight. And is that a moral, morally acceptable or not? Yeah,
it happens anyways already.
Yeah, of course, yeah. But I mean, there's the argument of whether or not that kind of thing should be okay or not. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing. I'm not sure. What are your feelings on that?
Well, I came from a very Christian background, and so I had that, I guess, innate revulsion to that idea when I first heard about it. But the more and more I thought about it, I thought that this could actually be, if we want to go down the cost saving route, if we want to go down the route of eliminating the draws on society and eliminating the like you talked about, increasing spending for police forces and increasing burden on the welfare state, then I think there's a lot of strong arguments to be made in favor of voluntary paid sterilization, because you would get the people who tend to give birth to criminals and give birth to people who then end up to have more and more kids that are societal problems. You would get those people signing up for the sterilization programs. And so, yes, it may have a disparate impact on certain groups over other groups, but I think the disparate impact they would have would ultimately be better for society and would ultimately be cost saving for society. You would get a lot less crime. I mean, this is one of my it's kind of interesting because we probably disagree about Roe v. Wade. I am more supportive of Roe v. Wade. And after Roe v. Wade, 18 years after Roe v. Wade was passed, you saw a drastic decrease in the amount of violent crime being committed in America.
Sure.
What's that?
Well, I was going to say, I'm pretty sure abortion doesn't that disproportionately affect like Black Americans. I'm pretty sure. I know I've heard the eugenics argument that's been made in terms of abortion, that abortion has allowed eugenics to occur in the Black community. That's something that I've heard. If your initial argument was something like, or your initial proposition was like sterilization that they didn't pay money for, I would probably be a lot more likely to say yes. But it's just financially incentivizing that becomes very worrisome for me. Just because like 18-year-olds are really dumb. Like, I don't know, like if an 18-year-old person is like, oh dude, $1,000, like I'm gonna go fucking do it, I don't know, that kind of stuff just makes me really nervous. It just in terms of like, again, the pragmatic way of how it plays out. But
yeah, it's kind of a new idea. I mean, we should let's think more about this and maybe have another conversation about this at a later date, because it's certainly a topic that I've been seeing discussed more and more lately online, and I'm sure reproductive health will be in the news for a lot for the foreseeable future. I mean, as Trump does more and more on the topic, people are going to be more and more incensed about it. And I can already tell. Hey, so where can people find you? First of all, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. It's good to have the conversation in person and not over snippy quote tweets, which I know is always a positive. So where can people find you? What do you do? What's your niche? And where can people find you on Twitch and the YouTube?
If you just go to my website, I think it's destiny.gg. All my links are at the top. I do pretty much 50-50 split now between video games and politics. So
cool. Good stuff. Well, hey, thanks for coming on, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah,
and
thanks
have
for
a good
having
night.
Me. Yeah, you too.
Cool. We're offline.
All right,
thanks
cool.
again.
Yep. Thanks a lot. Fuck. I didn't have I looked up so many stats for this, and I still didn't have some. Overall single parent households was a stat that we missed. Has that actually increased? That's a stat that I missed, even though I had the teenage things. And then I don't know. Are there any final questions or anything for this? I prepared an outline, but I didn't really get to control the flow of the conversation. So I try to do this thing where every person I debate, we try to steal like one of their abilities, kind of like what Walt does when he kills people in Breaking Bad. And I like this. I like the Fuentes approach to outlining the conversations.
I love your left ear too much. Help.
Going in, but I didn't really control the flow of the conversation. It would have been really nice to move from point to point. I didn't do that at all. I can practice that though. We can do better for that. I could have memorized my sources better so that I could cite them a little bit quicker, I think. Like that Chile... Wait, was it Chile? Oh, shit, no. Hold on. Oh, here we go. I thought this was really interesting. So a study published in the National Bureau of Economic Research in October of 2017. This study was published like I think 2 days ago. Our estimates suggest that due to the price hike, the weekly birth rate increased by 4%. I think this was in Chile, where we use sharp, massive, and unexpected price increases of oral contraceptives, product of a documented case of collusion among pharmaceutical retailers in Chile, as a natural experiment to estimate the impact of access to the pill on fertility and the newborn health. Our empirical strategy combines multiple sources of information and takes into account the seasonality of conceptions and the general trends of fertility, as well as the dynamics that arise after interrupting the pill's intake. Our estimates suggest that due to the price hike, the weekly birth rate increased by 4%. We show large effects on the number of children born to unmarried mothers, from mothers in their early 20s.
Here's what I learned in his channel. You won. You're short. You're circumcised. Nate probably is too, and you're something called a soy boy. Who won the debate? A. James, B. James, C. James.
Nice. We show large effects on the number of children born to unmarried mothers, from mothers in their early 20s and to prima-parich women. I don't know what this means. Moreover, we find evidence of the significant deterioration of newborn health as measured by the incidence of low birth weight and infant mortality. We suggest that the extra conception faced dire conditions during gestation, as a result of the mother's unhealthy behaviors. In addition, we document a disproportional increase of 27% in the weekly miscarriage and stillbirth rates, which we interpret as manifestations of active efforts of termination in a country where abortion was illegal. As the extra children reached school age, we find lower school enrollment rates and higher participations in programs for students with special needs. Our results suggest that access to contraceptives may prevent conceptions that will turn out to be relatively poor in health and thereby may improve the average health of children conceived. This was a really interesting study. I thought, but my goal for this conversation was, from the start, I said I wanted him to retreat to moral grounds, because I think at that point, I think the argument has been made sufficiently from my end. If I can get him to admit, and I think I did on all these points, right? I got him to admit that money can be saved by the state. I got him to admit that we can reduce the number of abortions. We didn't talk about this too much. That we can reduce the numbers of teens getting pregnant. We got him to admit that. And that we didn't really talk about the health impact much. It sounded like he started to drop that. I was familiar with that. 2007 study because you guys made me read this Breitbart shit. And that first study that he cited, it was a 2009 study. I said 2007. Was a 2009 study from the University of Texas. I knew this exact study because you guys brought it up on stream 2 days ago. And this only has to do with one particular type of birth control. It didn't have to do with oral contraception. It was one particular type. So I'm really glad that we brought that article up because I would have been lost here. So I actually researched this last night. I actually went through his Twitter because a lot of people were tweeting ideas at him when he accepted this debate. So I went through all of their tweets and I looked up a lot of the counter arguments there too. So I actually prepared for this quite a bit, and we didn't really get to talk even much about what about all the stuff that I had prepared for it. But yeah, I think you can't note all the points because you never transition. You keep asking questions to break apart their arguments, but then things are going their way. They take the initiative to move on, and then the cycle repeats. Oh yeah, maybe. Yeah, I was also kind of curious because he started to argue about sterilization at the end, but is he in favor of that? Because sterilization would do everything birth control does, right? That's kind of an interesting argument. I would have to think about that a lot. But I said as much to him that I would worry that the incentives would be there for that might not be good. Destiny, that's always what happens. He's right. You break them down but never move on. I guess the reason why I never move on, is because I'm always trying to drill down to what I consider right. If my argument starts here and his argument starts here, I want to settle at some point to where we've gotten to as close to the truth claim as possible. So if I say that A is 1 and he says that A is 2, I want to argue this until we come to some agreement, and my goal is to move them to 1. And if we don't get here and I can only move them to here or here or here, whatever, then at some point they have to agree to move on. Right, because because I believe that my points are true, so I'm never going to stop arguing them. Right, but maybe at some point, if I feel like I've sufficiently expressed my point, maybe I should just move on. I don't know. When you debate in public, it's not about getting the other person to agree; it's about getting the audience to your side. So, I was talking about this earlier with Aaron. When I have these kinds of discussions, when I do spontaneous content, that's what I excel at. Right, I excel at conversations on the fly, and I excel at doing live content. This is what I do the best at. My standard for prepared content is much, much, much higher. This is why I have such a problem doing it. Like, I don't think that what I do off the dome is worthy of being like put into a video and being put out as like, this is the argument or whatever, right? I don't agree with that. So I kind of take a similar approach to these kinds of debates. If I'm going to start preparing research and outlines for these conversations, it's not enough for me to just pull people from the middle. I genuinely want people on his side, very firmly rooted on his side, to start to question that narrative. My standard for who I want converted becomes higher at this point. So when we start these arguments, I don't just want people in the middle to go like, oh yeah, Destiny's got some good ideas. I want people on his side to go, you know, even though I kind of agree with him, he didn't really look that great in this conversation, or I don't really think he brought up a lot of good counter-arguments. Right, those are the kinds of thoughts that I want to foster. Kind of like in my Dick debate, right? His hardcore supporters will always love him, but when you looked on some of the more neutral subreddits, a lot of Dick Masterson's fans were saying those kinds of things, which felt really good, right? The things that like, well, I'm a huge Dick fan. I love him when he comes on this podcast, but he came off as really bad in this conversation, or it seemed like he didn't really know what he was saying, right? That's kind of the goal with the more prepared, more structured debates. Destiny, this guy and his supporters and other people in the alt-right and alt-right, they really, really seriously care about the idea of moral degeneracy. Many of them are nationalists, not libertarians or classical liberals. They aren't averse to the state overstepping bounds, and they aren't afraid of destroying contemporary moral norms. Unfortunately, these freely moral philosophical arguments are their bread and butter and have been since Weimar in the 1920s. But that's okay. I'm okay with that. I actually like that more. I like that people are being more honest today because they're being braver in their political ideas, right? So it used to be that like neoconservatives and whatnot were pretty blanketly fucking racist against black people, but they wouldn't come right out and say it, right? These things would take other forms like redlining or gentrification or restriction to welfare or mandatory drug testing for welfare people or papers, please in Arizona or stop and frisk in New York, right? They had these ways of kind of getting around it and not being actually racist, but doing it for the betterment of America, for everybody to be happier, right? But now they're just plain coming out and saying like, well, I hate black people. Get them out of the fucking country. I don't want any more Hispanics coming here. Only white Europeans. Get these fuckers out, right? I like that because, okay, well, now we can have, if you want to do that, firstly, it means that you've ceded every single economic argument, which is cool. If you want to cede everything, you've already lost a huge support, right? If you want to say that, like, well, economically and pragmatically, your ideas are horrible, right? If you want to retreat into only philosophical grounds, then you can start taking up those arguments. And I think those arguments can be fruitful. That's fine. I think that you can defend the idea that you shouldn't have a white ethno-state. That shouldn't scare you. If it scares you to engage a Nazi in philosophical debate over whether or not the motherland should exist for only whites, like, I mean, read some arguments. It's not that hard, I don't think, to argue against that kind of stuff.